You know, you buy a house in a nice, quiet neighborhood, thinking you found your little slice of peace, and then you meet them. The HOA, and worse, their self-appointed queen, Karen. My Karen didn't just complain about the length of my grass. Oh no, she escalated things to a biblical plague level, literally flooding my backyard with raw sewage, which, in a twist of beautiful, karmic irony, ended up creating a sinkhole that began to swallow her own house. And when the HOA had the gall to sue me for the smell she caused, and then for the sinkhole her actions created under her house, well, let's just say my security cameras and a good lawyer had the last, very satisfying laugh. It all started subtly enough, as these neighborhood horror stories often do. I'd moved into the Willows Creek subdivision about 2 years prior, a lovely place with mature trees and, unfortunately, a homeowners association that seemed to exist solely to justify its own budget through an endless stream of nitpicking. My immediate neighbor to the north was Carol Peterson, but everyone, including, eventually myself, came to know her as Karen. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a meticulously maintained bob haircut that looked like it could deflect small arms fire and an equally rigid demeanor. She was the treasurer of the HOA board, a position she wielded with the solemnity of a Roman emperor holding the fate of the empire in her hands. Our first interaction was over my recycling bin, which I'd apparently left out 3 hours past the designated retrieval window. She didn't knock on my door. She left a laminated, passive-aggressive note tucked under my windshield wiper, highlighted in fluorescent yellow. That was my introduction to Karen's reign. For a while, I managed to fly mostly under her radar, keeping my lawn to the precise 3-inch HOA standard, ensuring my holiday decorations were dismantled by January 15th sharp, and generally trying to be an invisible, compliant resident. My backyard was my sanctuary, a decent-sized plot that I'd put a lot of effort into cultivating. I had a small vegetable garden, a thriving patch of hydrangeas, and a lovely little flagstone patio where I enjoyed my morning coffee. It backed up to a small, wooded common area, and for the most part, it was peaceful. The problems began about 6 months after I moved in, starting with a faint, unpleasant odor that would occasionally waft over from Karen's side of the property line. It wasn't constant, but it was noticeable, especially on warmer days. I initially dismissed it as perhaps a problem with her garbage cans or a composting mishap. Then, I noticed a perpetually damp patch near our shared fence, directly downhill from her house, as her property sloped slightly towards mine. It wasn't large, but it was consistently moist, and the grass there was a sickly, dark green. I mentioned it to her once, politely. "Carol," I'd said, catching her as she was walking past my driveway, "I've noticed a bit of a damp spot near the fence, and sometimes there's a funny smell. Is everything all right with your plumbing or septic, perhaps?" She stopped, gave me a look that could curdle milk, and replied, "My property is perfectly maintained, unlike some. Perhaps you should check your own drainage." Then she sniffed, as if my very question was an affront, and marched off. The HOA, when I casually inquired if there had been any general plumbing issues reported in the area, was equally unhelpful, sending me a pamphlet on proper yard maintenance and a reminder about not overwatering my lawn. The subtle unpleasantness continued, a low-grade annoyance I tried to ignore. I even considered installing a French drain along that section of the fence, thinking perhaps it was just poor natural drainage exacerbated by her sprinkler system. I began documenting things, just in case. A small notebook where I'd jot down dates, times, and observations about the smell and the dampness. It felt a bit paranoid, but Karen's initial reaction had set off a small alarm bell in my head. My peace was being incrementally eroded, and the source seemed to be my perfectly maintained neighbor and the HOA she practically embodied. The first truly alarming incident occurred about a year into this olfactory ordeal. I came home from work one Friday to find a distinct pool of gray, murky water in that same spot, now visibly extending a few feet into my yard, and the smell was no longer faint. It was a distinct, stomach-turning aroma of sewage. The small pool of gray, murky water in my backyard was the turning point. It wasn't just dampness anymore. It was undeniably wastewater, and the stench was acrid, almost unbearable. I immediately went over to Karen's house. She answered the door with a thinly veiled expression of annoyance, as if my presence on her doorstep was a personal imposition. "Carol," I began, trying to keep my voice even. "There's a significant amount, what appears to be sewage water pooling in my yard, coming from under the fence on your side. The smell is terrible. You really need to get a plumber to look at this immediately." She crossed her arms, her lips thinning into a severe line. "I already told you, my property is fine," she stated, her voice sharp. "If there's a smell in your yard, it's your problem. Perhaps it's your dog." I didn't own a dog. "Carol, this isn't a general smell, and it's not my dog because I don't have one. This is wastewater, and it's flowing directly from your property into mine. I can show you," she scoffed. "I'm not interested in your landscaping issues. I have a very important HOA budget meeting to prepare for." And with that, she closed the door in my face. I was stunned by her audacity and utter lack of concern. The next morning, the pool was larger, and the smell had intensified, making my patio unusable. I called the county health department, but they said, unless it was a public main break, disputes between neighbors over private sewer lines were a civil matter, though they did offer to send out an inspector if it became a persistent public nuisance. I also called the HOA again, this time demanding they address the issue. Their response was a formal letter a few days later, not to Karen, but to me. It was a warning. It stated that they had received multiple complaints. I suspected Karen was the sole complainant, if not the author, about an offensive odor emanating from my property and improper water discharge, instructing me to rectify the situation within 7 days or face fines. I was incandescent with rage. They were blaming me for the stench Karen was creating. This was beyond negligence. It felt like a coordinated attack. That's when I decided I needed more than just a notebook. I went out and bought 2 high-quality outdoor security cameras. I installed one overlooking my driveway and front porch, standard practice. The second one, however, was strategically placed. I mounted it discreetly on a tall bird feeder pole I positioned near my back patio, angling it to cover the entire section of the fence line where the water was seeping through, with a clear view of Karen's backyard adjacent to that area. I wanted to see exactly what was happening. The footage, over the next few weeks, was illuminating and infuriating. Initially, it was mostly just the steady seepage. But then, I started noticing a pattern. The flow would significantly increase in the late evenings, usually between 10 p.m. and midnight, and sometimes very early in the morning. It wasn't just a passive leak. Reviewing the footage, I caught glimpses of Karen. She had what looked like a flexible drainage pipe, the kind you attach to a sump pump or gutter downspout, usually coiled near her back utility area. On several nights, the camera captured her, sometimes with a flashlight, uncoiling this pipe and directing it towards the fence, tucking the end just under the fence line so it discharged directly onto my property. It was deliberate. She was actively pumping wastewater into my yard. The sheer malice of it was breathtaking. My beautiful backyard was slowly transforming into a stinking, swampy mess. The hydrangeas near the fence yellowed and died. The vegetable garden was a no-go zone. I couldn't open my windows on that side of the house. My life was being dictated by the stench and the muck. Each communication with the HOA was a masterpiece of Kafkaesque bureaucracy. They'd acknowledge my complaints about Karen, promise to look into it, and then send me another violation notice for the smell and the standing water creating a mosquito hazard. Karen, meanwhile, would parade past my house with an air of smug triumph. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she clearly believed she was untouchable. The stress was immense. I documented every incident, cross-referencing it with the video timestamps. I saved every email, every letter from the HOA. I started researching local ordinances, water rights, and nuisance laws. My little notebook was now a thick binder, a testament to Karen's campaign of sewage-fueled terror and the HOA's complicity. The constant saturation of my backyard with Karen's deliberately pumped sewage was taking a toll, not just on my plants and my sanity, but on the ground itself. My yard slopes gently downwards from her property, so all that wastewater, day after day, night after night, was concentrating in the lowest lying area along our shared fence line, exactly where she was directing her pipe. I'd noticed the ground becoming spongier, squishier than it should be, even during dry spells. It was perpetually muddy, and the smell was now a permanent fixture, a vile miasma that clung to everything. I had placed stepping stones to navigate the worst of it, but even those seemed to sink a little deeper each week. One Saturday morning, about 3 months into Karen's nightly sewage dumping ritual captured on camera, I was out attempting to salvage what I could of a rose bush that was looking increasingly distressed. As I surveyed the soggy mess, I noticed a small, almost perfectly circular depression in the ground. It was about 2 feet in diameter and maybe 6 inches deep, located right against the fence, more on my side but perilously close to the boundary. It hadn't been there the day before. My heart sank a little. More problems. I poked it with a garden stake. The ground felt unusually soft, yielding with little resistance. I initially thought it might be an animal burrow, but it didn't look like one. Over the next week, that depression began to grow. It slowly widened and deepened, like a malevolent dimple forming in the earth. I took photos of it daily, adding them to my burgeoning collection of evidence. I even mentioned it to Karen, more out of a sense of morbid curiosity about her reaction than any expectation of help. "Karen," I called over the fence one afternoon, "have you noticed this dip forming here? It's getting quite large." She peered over, her face a mask of disdain. "That's on your property, isn't it? Probably all that water you're allowing to accumulate. You really should do something about your drainage." She sniffed before turning her back and marching inside. The irony was so thick I could have bottled it and sold it as a particularly potent form of liquid cluelessness. The depression continued its slow, inexorable expansion. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was woken by a strange, grinding, groaning sound, followed by a muffled crash. It was just before dawn. I rushed to my back window, my heart pounding. The sight that greeted me was both terrifying and, I confess, laced with a tiny, shameful thread of dark satisfaction. The small depression was no longer small. It had collapsed dramatically overnight, forming a significant sinkhole, probably 10 feet across and alarmingly deep. The fence between our properties was sagging precariously into it. But the truly stunning part was that the sinkhole hadn't respected property lines. A good portion of it was now under the rear corner of Karen's house. Her meticulously maintained flower beds were gone, swallowed by the earth, and the corner of her beige stucco house, the part housing her sunroom, was visibly cracked and slumping downwards into the abyss. Pieces of her foundation were exposed, looking jagged and vulnerable. And Karen? Karen was outside in her silk pajamas and robe, shrieking. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated panic, a stark contrast to her usual icy composure. My house! My house is falling!" she screamed, running back and forth on what remained of her patio, her face pale with terror. Neighbors started emerging, drawn by the commotion. The smell, which had always been bad, was now truly horrific, as the collapsing earth seemed to have released a fresh wave of concentrated stench from the saturated soil. It was the reek of her own making, now literally undermining her own existence. The HOA president, Mr. Henderson, a usually flustered man, arrived looking utterly bewildered. Karen immediately accosted him, pointing a shaking finger at me as I stood on my own patio, silently observing the chaos. "It's her fault!" Karen shrieked, her voice cracking. "She did this! She deliberately undermined my house! Arrest her!" The absurdity of the accusation, given the months of my documented complaints and her deliberate sewage dumping, was almost laughable if the situation hadn't been so dire for her, and potentially for the structural integrity of the neighborhood. In the immediate aftermath of the sinkhole's dramatic appearance under Karen's house, a strange sort of stunned silence descended upon the cul-de-sac, punctuated only by Karen's sporadic, hysterical accusations and the distant wail of approaching emergency services she'd undoubtedly summoned. Firefighters and a building inspector arrived, cordoning off Karen's backyard and a portion of mine with yellow caution tape. Her sunroom was declared structurally unsound, and she was advised to evacuate, at least temporarily. The HOA board, spearheaded by a now even more flustered President Henderson and a visibly shaken, but still quietly seething Karen, went into immediate crisis mode. Their first official act, however, wasn't to investigate the clear cause, the months of concentrated wastewater leakage, but to find a scapegoat. And that scapegoat, naturally, was me. Within 48 hours, while Karen was holed up in a local motel, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen, I received an emergency certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel. It was a masterpiece of baseless accusation and aggressive posturing. They formally accused me of negligent landscaping practices, improper alteration of groundwater flow, and willful creation of a geological hazard that directly led to the destabilization of Mrs. Carol Peterson's property and surrounding common areas. They demanded I immediately cease any activities contributing to the soil erosion, a rich claim, given the source of the saturation, and that I would be held financially responsible for all current and future damages, including the full cost of repairing Karen's home, stabilizing the ground, and any diminution of property values in the neighborhood. The letter hinted darkly at imminent legal action if I didn't agree to their terms within 5 business days. It was so outrageously disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. Almost. The threat of a lawsuit, however baseless, was still a serious matter. My meticulously compiled binder of evidence, once a source of grim satisfaction, now felt like my shield and sword. I immediately contacted a lawyer, a highly recommended local attorney named Sarah Mills, who specialized in property disputes and HOA litigation. I laid out the entire sordid tale for her, from the first faint smells to the laminated notes, the increasing sewage flow, the HOA's dismissive responses, my video evidence of Karen actively directing the wastewater, the photos of the sinkhole's progression, and finally, the threatening letter from the HOA. Sarah listened patiently, occasionally jotting down notes, her expression shifting from neutral to incredulous, and then to something approaching professional relish. When I finished and played a few key snippets of the nighttime video footage of Karen with her pipe, Sarah leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said, a small smile playing on her lips, "this is quite something. They've accused you of causing a sinkhole because your neighbor decided to turn your backyard into her personal septic drain field, and the HOA, instead of addressing her violations, decided to blame the victim. This isn't just defense. We might have a very strong counterclaim here. Her confidence was infectious and a massive relief. Over the next few weeks, under Sarah's guidance, we began to formally prepare. She advised me to get a professional geological survey and a hydrology report done on my property and the affected area. The geologist I hired was fascinated. His preliminary findings, even before soil borings, strongly suggested that the prolonged, concentrated introduction of wastewater into the loamy clay soil common in our area had supersaturated the subsoil, leading to a loss of cohesion and, ultimately, a localized collapse when a void likely formed beneath. The sewage acted as both a lubricant and an erosive agent. He noted that the specific location and formation were entirely consistent with the wastewater discharge point I'd identified and documented. The HOA, meanwhile, doubled down. They officially filed a lawsuit, a sprawling document full of legal jargon that essentially reiterated their previous accusations. I had, through unspecified nefarious means, caused the sinkhole that damaged Karen's house and threatened the community. They were suing me for damages amounting to nearly $500,000, covering repairs, Karen's displacement costs, and punitive damages for my supposed malicious intent. Karen, of course, provided a sworn affidavit supporting their claims, painting herself as the innocent victim of my destructive machinations. The lawsuit papers were served to me by a smug-looking process server, an event Karen, who had apparently briefly returned to her property, avoiding the condemned sunroom, watched from her window with undisguised glee. She probably thought she had me cornered. Little did she know, my video cameras had been her silent, impartial judges all along. The lawsuit filed by the HOA against me, with Karen as their star victim, kicked off a period of intense legal maneuvering and what the legal world politely calls discovery. For me, it was more like a slow, deliberate unearthing of every piece of dirty laundry Karen and the HOA had tried to bury. Sarah Mills, my attorney, was an absolute shark in a sensible pantsuit. She filed a robust answer to their complaint, denying all their ludicrous allegations, and simultaneously filed a hefty counterclaim against both the HOA and Karen individually. Against Karen, we claimed private nuisance, trespass for the sewage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Against the HOA, we alleged negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, for failing to enforce their own rules against Karen and instead targeting me, and aiding and abetting Karen's nuisance. We sought damages for the restoration of my backyard, my legal fees, and punitive damages for their egregious behavior. The discovery process was where my meticulous record-keeping truly began to shine. The HOA's lawyer, a pompous fellow named Bartholomew Kensington III, I kid you not, that was his name, and he had the condescending demeanor to match, initially tried the bullying approach. He sent over voluminous, largely irrelevant discovery requests, clearly designed to overwhelm and intimidate. Sarah, however, met his bluster with calm, surgical precision. Our responses were concise, factual, and always pointed back to the core issue: Karen's sewage. The depositions were particularly enlightening. Karen's deposition was a masterclass in self-pity and fabrication. She swore under oath that she had no idea where the water was coming from, that her plumbing was state-of-the-art, and that she believed I had been digging holes and diverting underground streams in my backyard for months, probably as part of some bizarre vendetta against her because she was a diligent HOA board member. She described the smell as originating from my poorly maintained compost heap — I didn't have one — and general lack of hygiene. Bartholomew looked increasingly uncomfortable as her testimony grew more outlandish, but he pressed on, trying to build his narrative of me as a rogue, destructive neighbor. Then it was Mr. Henderson's turn, the HOA president. He waffled. He equivocated. He claimed ignorance on most specific questions about my complaints, falling back on board confidentiality or ongoing investigations, even for events that had happened months prior. When Sarah presented him with copies of my letters and emails to the HOA, meticulously dated and detailing the escalating sewage problem, he stammered that he couldn't recall seeing them, or that they had been delegated to the appropriate committee. He couldn't, however, explain why the appropriate committee had then chosen to send me violation notices instead of addressing Karen's actions. The real fireworks, however, were reserved for when Sarah strategically revealed the existence of the video evidence. During a pretrial conference, after months of them building their case on Karen's demonstrably false testimony, Sarah calmly informed Bartholomew Kensington III that we possessed hours of high-definition video footage. This footage, she explained, clearly and irrefutably showed his client, Mrs. Peterson, on multiple occasions, actively and intentionally directing a pipe discharging wastewater from her property directly onto mine. She mentioned specific dates and times, cross-referenced with my complaint logs to the HOA. Bartholomew's face went from smug to pale in about 3 seconds. He demanded to see the footage immediately. Sarah, smiling sweetly, said, "Of course, Mr. Kensington. We'd be happy to provide it as part of our supplemental discovery production. Perhaps you and Mrs. Peterson and the HOA board would like to review it together before our next settlement conference." The implied threat was clear. Your entire case is built on a lie, and we can prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. The HOA's bravado visibly deflated after that. We heard, through back channels, that their emergency board meeting was chaotic. Karen reportedly had a meltdown, first denying the videos could exist, then claiming they were faked, then hysterically accusing everyone of conspiring against her. Their lawyer, Bartholomew, suddenly became much more amenable to discussing a settlement. Their initial offer was insulting. They'd drop their lawsuit if I dropped my counterclaim, and everyone walked away, with me still responsible for my own yard and legal fees. Sarah laughed. "Absolutely not," she told him. "Your clients are facing significant liability for malicious prosecution on top of everything else if we go to trial. The next offer had better be serious." The stress of the lawsuit was undeniable, casting a shadow over my life. But with each passing day, as our evidence was laid out and their case unraveled, a sense of grim determination and even anticipation began to grow within me. The HOA and Karen had picked a fight with the wrong person, someone who had not only the patience to document their wrongdoing, but also the receipts, or in this case, the videotapes, to prove it. The prospect of a full-blown trial, with our video evidence as the centerpiece, clearly terrified the HOA and Karen. Bartholomew Kensington III, stripped of his initial arrogance, requested an urgent settlement conference facilitated by a retired judge acting as a mediator. He knew that if those videos were played in open court, not only would their lawsuit against me be laughed out of existence, but the HOA board members could face personal liability for their negligence, and Karen for her malicious actions and perjury during her deposition. The settlement conference was held in a sterile room at the mediator's office. On one side sat Sarah and me, calm and prepared. On the other, a visibly deflated Mr. Henderson, 2 other nervous-looking HOA board members, a stony-faced Karen who refused to make eye contact, and a deeply unhappy Bartholomew. The mediator, a pragmatic and experienced man named Judge Harrison, started by asking Bartholomew to outline the HOA's case. Bartholomew's presentation was a shadow of its former bombast. He mumbled something about unfortunate misunderstandings and complex ground dynamics, carefully avoiding any direct accusation against me. When it was Sarah's turn, she didn't mince words. She briefly recapped Karen's actions, the HOA's complicity, and the mountain of evidence we had. Then, she said, "Your Honor, rather than describe it, perhaps it's best if we simply show you a small sample." She had brought a laptop and a projector. Bartholomew immediately protested. "This is a settlement conference, not a trial. This is prejudicial." Judge Harrison raised a hand. "Mr. Kensington, if this footage is as compelling as Miss Mills suggests, it's highly relevant to understanding the potential outcome at trial, which is precisely what we are here to avoid. Please proceed, Ms. Mills." Sarah dimmed the lights and played a curated highlights reel. There was Karen, clear as day, sneaking out in her bathrobe late at night, flashlight in hand, wrestling with the flexible pipe, aiming its gushing contents directly under the fence towards my yard. There were multiple instances, day and night. The audio picked up the sound of the pump and the splashing water. Then, Sarah transitioned to photos of my progressively devastated backyard, the sickly plants, the pooling sewage, followed by the daily progression shots of the sinkhole forming, starting as a small dimple and growing, with timestamps correlating perfectly with the periods of heaviest discharge. The room was silent, save for the click of the slideshow. Karen stared at her hands, her face flushed a deep mottled red. Mr. Henderson looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him, though preferably not via a sinkhole. When Sarah switched the lights back on, Judge Harrison looked gravely at the HOA contingent. "Mr. Kensington," he said, his voice low and firm. "Frankly, I'm astounded. Based on what I've just seen, your lawsuit against this lady appears not only baseless, but potentially frivolous and brought in bad faith. Mrs. Peterson," he addressed Karen directly, "your actions are deeply concerning." He then turned to the HOA representatives. "And the board's failure to address this issue when it was repeatedly reported, and then to sue the victim? That's a serious dereliction of duty. The wind completely out of their sails, the negotiation, if you could call it that, began. Our demands were straightforward. The HOA and Karen would formally withdraw their lawsuit with prejudice. They would issue a formal, written apology to me. They would cover all my legal fees. They would pay for the complete excavation, soil remediation, and restoration of my backyard to its original condition, including replacing the damaged fence, performed by contractors of my choosing and to my satisfaction. Furthermore, Karen's homeowner's insurance, or Karen herself, if insurance denied the claim due to her intentional acts, would be responsible for the damages to her own property and any stabilization required for the sinkhole, with no liability to me. Finally, we demanded a significant sum in punitive damages from the HOA for their gross negligence and malicious prosecution, and a separate, smaller sum from Karen for nuisance and emotional distress. Bartholomew sputtered, but Judge Harrison, looking at their pale faces, merely said, "Gentlemen, Mrs. Peterson, I suggest you consider this very carefully. Miss Mills's client has been through an ordeal, and this evidence is overwhelming. Going to trial would likely result in a far worse outcome for you, including potentially much higher punitive damages and public exposure." After a tense adjournment where they huddled in another room, they came back. They agreed to every single one of our terms. The settlement agreement was drafted and signed within a week. The sense of vindication was immense, a profound weight lifting from my shoulders. Over the next few months, my backyard underwent a transformation. geoengineers and landscapers, chosen by me, and paid for by the HOA's insurance, which had thankfully not yet realized the full extent of the board's complicity in ignoring Karen's initial acts, excavated the contaminated soil, shored up the area where the sinkhole had been, installed proper drainage, and then rebuilt my garden, patio, and fence. It looked even better than before. Karen's house, meanwhile, was a disaster. Her insurance company, after their own investigation, which undoubtedly included our evidence, denied most of her claim, citing her deliberate actions contributing to the loss. The corner of her house remained propped up on temporary shoring, a monument to her malice. The cost to properly repair the foundation and the sinkhole under her property was astronomical. Within 6 months, unable to afford the repairs and facing ongoing pressure from the now deeply embarrassed HOA, which had undergone a rapid and overdue change in leadership, Karen sold her house as is for a pittance to a developer who planned to demolish it and rebuild. She moved away, hopefully to a place with no neighbors and no HOA to empower her petty tyrannies. The day the sold sign went up on her dilapidated property was a quiet moment of triumph for me. My backyard is now my sanctuary again. The air is clean, the flowers bloom, and the only water flowing is from my well-maintained sprinkler system. I still have my security cameras, though. You never know when another Karen might move in. But if one does, I'll be ready. And if you're out there, dealing with your own HOA nightmare or a neighbor from hell, remember this. Document everything, stand your ground, and don't be afraid to fight for your peace. Sometimes, the sweetest justice is the kind you meticulously build, one piece of evidence at a time, until their whole rotten edifice collapses in on itself, just like Karen's sunroom into that sewage-filled sinkhole she dug for herself.